Well, welcome everybody. Why don't we go ahead and get started? I know from past experience, people might jump in as we're going through the process here. I just wanted to welcome everybody to this month's Idea Lab. We will be recording this talk and putting it on our YouTube channel. So if you have colleagues that weren't able to make it today, please let them know that this topic, as well as many other helpful topics, are out on our channel. This topic of conflict resolution came about because of a project we were working on with one of our members, Change the Trend. We were talking about homelessness and how we might all be better at having the conversation among ourselves around this topic. And then we've seen lots of changes in policy and procedures in our office and in our lives. And so we thought that now more than ever, we may need to, talk and look at some tools around all of these changes. One last comment I'll make is something that resonated with me at last night's city council meeting when they introduced the new sustainability coordinator, Melissa England. At the end of her presentation, she said, "I look forward to working with all of you at the speed of trust." And it made me think that all of these changes have not really allowed us to develop that trust. It takes time to build the relationships, and those relationships help us work together through these changes. But they've come so quickly. And so with that, I would like to introduce someone that may help us develop some tools to help us through all of this. Ames Stenson, Restorative Justice Program Manager with the Englewood Municipal Court. Ames, did I get that right? And I'll let you take it over from there.
That's great, David. Thank you very much. Yeah, right on. I love that. Yeah, the speed of trust. What does that look like? What does that mean? And how does it play a role in responding to conflicts, both in our own personal lives as well as within our workplace setting, for sure. So this is meant to be somewhat interactive. So I'm hoping that even if you're not able to join us on your screen, you'll be able to respond a bit in the chat. I think that one of the most beneficial pieces of engaging in these kinds of conversations is that we can work with real material, not to work through one specific thing and name names and all that. That's not what I mean, but to really make it applicable to our current realities versus kind of staying in the external theories and what ifs. So I invite us to settle into that and participate in that way if you're at all able to. So thank you so much for having me in your introduction, David. I'm Ames Stenson. I use pronouns they, them, theirs. I am currently the program manager, as David mentioned, of the Englewood Municipal Court Restorative Justice Program. That's a newer program that just started last year through the generous work and support of so many people in our city council, our judge, our senior manager, Sean, and just so many people. The Englewood Schools has been such a part of it, the Englewood Police Department, and so many others to be of support to bringing this kind of program to Englewood. So at the very end, I'll kind of name, I'll give a little invitation if you'd like to learn more specifically about our restorative justice program and how we use some of these concepts within a court setting. But for today, what I wanted to do was just engage in a little bit of conversation around what does it mean to have a restorative response to conflict. And so with that, before I share with you my PowerPoint here, I was curious if folks, just for the sake of knowing who's here on the call today, if you wouldn't mind just putting in the chat your names, your pronouns, and then what business or organization you're a part of, just so that I know kind of who's here. That would be really, really helpful. So that's one, if you wouldn't mind doing that. And then the second request is, why are you at this session? Right? Why are we here talking about Why are we here talking about conflict? Why are you here in this session? And what's something that you hope to take away from the session? So I know those were several requests. So your name, who you're with, why you're at the session, and maybe what's something you're hoping to get out of the session. So while you all are typing this in, I don't know about you all, but I have a hard time like typing and listening, but I don't want there to be total dead space. So I'll just share a little bit about me and why I'm here. Yeah, hi Darren, good to see you again. Trying to learn in this topic of interest. Okay, cool, thank you. So I've been in the work of restorative justice, conflict resolution in some capacity for about 11 years, working in with young people in the juvenile justice system, with adults and nonprofit organizations, with young leaders, young adults within a national service organization, really looking at how can the use of restorative practices support our development and our ability to be leaders and to resolve conflicts, to be lifelong learners of how do we learn from the conflicts that are here, how do we practice the introspection needed and the development of self-awareness skills to be able to work through these conflicts, and to be in better relationship with each other, to be in building better trust with one another. Yeah, thank you, Sonora. Good to see you. Yay, Tracy, yes, hi Tracy. Awesome. All right, yeah, if you've just joined us, welcome. I'm asking for folks to put in the chat your name, your organization, and why you're here today. What are you interested in taking away? Oh yes, hi Carol, good to see you again. This is the surface. Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks Lindsay, hi. So as we know, there's so many different ways that we can talk about conflict, right? And the first thing, and I apologize because usually in the past, I have like small breakout groups that folks can kind of chat and get to know each other. So we're being creative in using the chat here. But one thing that I just want to help us ground in, and then I'll kind of weave some of my other experience as we go along here today. But the request is, when you think of the word conflict, what's the first thing that comes to your brain? And just put it in the chat, if you will. When you think of conflict, what's maybe the visceral experience? What is just your first thought? Yeah, fighting, anger, misunderstanding. Yeah. Uneasy, yeah. Miscommunication. Yeah, disagreements, stress, problems, misunderstandings, absolutely. Does anyone immediately think like, oh, this is an opportunity? Sometimes, but not usually. That's not usually what happens, right? Usually what happens, yeah, differences of opinions or values or cultures, absolutely. And yeah, so oftentimes we think about conflict initially as this very stressful, very challenging, it's uncomfortable, it's uneasy. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for naming that, Sean. Like sometimes that actually becomes how we communicate with one another, right? Like we communicate as a family system or as a business system, like through arguing or through conflict. And so that becomes a way that we kind of have to learn, how do we adapt? How do we engage in the conversation in order to be heard? And in order to be heard, sometimes we have to engage in the standard of communication, right? And if that's rooted in arguing or conflict, then we got to figure out how to do that. We have to know how to do that. And ultimately, we get to keep asking ourselves, how do those things, the choices that we make in responding to conflict, do they ultimately support us? Do they ultimately help us in getting what it is that we're wanting to create, if it's clarity or understanding or whatever the case may be, right? So just to name that, conflict is inevitable. We are humans, we live in human processes, human systems, human relationships. There's always going to be conflict. And so it's so interesting that oftentimes our initial responses to conflict is this negative connotation, right? And so that in and of itself can allow us and kind of lead us down this path of, oh man, I'm in conflict. And then we kind of instantly have this maybe frame or lens of challenge or stress or whatever, you know, initial response comes up in us around that idea of conflict. And as we know, language is important. So if we could think about conflict as, wow, this is really uncomfortable. Something's happening inside of me. And yet the situation itself, it's a challenge. It's an opportunity. How might that shift our frame of how we're able to engage with it, right? So when we're in a conflict, let's say in our family or in work, if our initial response is, oh, this is a conflict, I'm stressed out, I don't want to deal with this, I feel really uncomfortable, and I'm continuing to spiral in the energy of that, that's way more difficult to deal with, right, than noticing what's happening inside of me, attending to that, and then being able to make a different choice around how we engage with conflict. So all of those things just to kind of mention and say that yes, conflict brings up a lot in us because of what we've taught, what we've been taught, what we've learned, our experiences in life, and we still ultimately have the opportunity to make choices around how we respond. And when we can be in our, not in our fight, flight, or freeze brain, but in that prefrontal cortex, right, where we're able to slow down and take a breath and make choices, we have a lot more available to us as far as how we respond. So with that, just for the sake of this word being brought into our conversation this morning, what comes up for you all when you instantly when you think of the word trust? What is that initial connotation that comes up? And again, if you would, I invite you to stick it in the chat. Yeah, partnership. It's earned, okay. So there's a component there that it's not just given, but there's like something that we do to build each other's trust. Is that true, Lindsay, based on what you shared? Yeah. Safety, yes, absolutely. So relationships, yeah, connection, vulnerability, absolutely. History. Tracy, I think I know what you mean, but would you be willing to say more or type more, just so I'm not making up stories? Why does history kind of come to you around trust? If you're open to that.
I was trying to unmute, sorry.
That's okay.
I just meant having history with a person. So having experience or historical, like to have trust, like to have that history.
Totally. Yeah, thank you. So again, interesting to just note what comes up for us when we think of this word, trust specifically, and how often do we think of conflict and trust as kind of two opposite sides of the spectrum, right? But what if we could look at them as actually conflict is a thing, it happens, but how we engage in the choices that we make can either help us build trust in that, or it can disconnect us further and it further creates lack of trust, right? So it's all about how and what are our choice points in the conflicts. And obviously we have very different experiences of what conflicts are and what that means to us, and our experiences and what we were taught around how we initially respond and the skills in order to respond differently. So the good news is that, or bad news, I don't know, I wish we could resolve all of this within the next, whatever, 50 minutes, right? Which we're certainly not going to. But what I would love to do is just hear from you all a little bit more around some of your common conflicts that you experience at work. Again, I'm not asking you to share names, I'm not asking you to go into details, but what are some of the themes that you notice of conflicts? So maybe it's communication conflicts, maybe it's work style, right? Maybe it's leadership. What are some of those themes that you all experience in your workplace settings? And again, if you wouldn't mind putting those in the chat, that would be great. That would be helpful in kind of launching us into this next piece here. Miscommunication, different organizational focal points, it looks like, different visions, yeah. And then lack of trust that keeps those keeps creating some barriers around that communication. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So for the sake of this conversation here today, roles, responsibilities, absolutely. And maybe some clarity or lack of clarity or who's doing what. Is that accurate, David, to say? Yeah, lack of clarity. Great, thank you. Yeah, respect, trust, power, stress, communication, unclear expectations, absolutely. Responses that may or may not be accurate. Yeah, the assumptions that we make, the stories that we make up, right? But then that absolutely frame how we respond to something, because we've already made up a story about what that is, and then we've responded from that story, which we don't even know is necessarily true, right? So it's all of these layers and levels of recognizing what's happening internally, but then also recognizing how is that impacting the way that I'm behaving externally. Awesome. Okay, these are really helpful. Thank you all for just helping to kind of prime the pump here as we're going to move into further engagement around. And I'm going to share with you my screen here. Can you all see that okay? Okay, great. So I'm going to keep asking you to engage. So FYI, if you're able to still kind of chime in on the chat here, I think that would be really helpful. So I just wanted to name a couple kind of common workplace conflict areas that we tend to see. And you all have named them, I think almost all of them in the chat here. And not to dive into more of what these are necessarily, but these tend to be some pretty important themes that happen. And the bottom line is that, you know, regardless of what the workplace conflict is, we can look at data and see all of the ways that it impacts productivity, satisfaction, longevity, our workplace cultures, right? Our creativity to really truly engage. We know that these kinds of conflicts can impact our health and the way that we show up in workplaces as well. So there's so many different ways that these kinds of conflicts have a role and impact our ability to do our jobs and to be in relationship and to build trust with one another. So what I want to do is share with you what is restorative justice? What is restorative practices? Because ultimately, I want us to be thinking about what are some restorative responses to conflict? Well, in order to know what does that even mean, we got to know, well, what is restorative justice? How am I using that word, right? And again, language is so important in how we're engaging in communication with each other. So I always like to joke and say that if you ask a restorative justice practitioner what the definition is, if you ask 10 different practitioners, you're going to get 10 different responses for the sake of the nuances, right? But in the Englewood Municipal Court Restorative Justice Program, this is how we're defining that term. So I want to break this down for you, and then for us to engage in how does that play a role, or why do I care, and how does that play a role in my work setting specifically. So restorative justice practices are victim-centered, community-based responses to a crime or conflict, which create opportunities for accountability, repairing harm, and restoring relationships. So just a couple things to emphasize here. They're victim-centered, or we use the terms harmed party-centered, in the sense that they're voluntary responses. Everyone's got to choose to participate in responding to a harm in this specific way. We ask for people to have a voice and to say, how were you impacted in what took place? It's not a conversation. It's, if you were to look at this in a work setting, of kind of removing people third party. This is bringing together people into a conversation that's facilitated and structured in a way that's asking everyone how they've been impacted specifically. Community-based in the sense that it also is asking and saying that harms and conflicts happen within the context of a community. So if we're thinking about this in a workplace setting, right, harms impact and conflicts impact the larger workplace community, whether we think that they do or not, right? If there's something happening in one team, it's absolutely going to have an impact on everyone else who's there. And so the opportunity in restorative justice is to think about when harms occur, it's not just that a conflict has occurred and that a law or a policy has been broken. It's actually looking at it from a relational aspect. So we say in restorative practices that a relationship has been harmed, a relationship has been impacted, trust has been broken. So what are the opportunities then to create opportunities for accountability? And what does accountability actually mean? How do we repair the harm, and who's responsible for repairing the harm? Or, you know, the impact. If someone doesn't want to name it as harm, there's still been an impact, right? How do we do that? And then in that process, how are we restoring relationships? How are we emphasizing relationships? So you're going to hear all of those terms again, but I just wanted you to have kind of a general sense of, here's what I mean when I'm saying this concept of restorative justice, restorative practices, that it's relational based. We're responding based on who's been impacted and what needs to be done to repair the harm, and who's going to be doing that. Those are some of the key questions that we ask in restorative practices. And please, at any point, jump in, put in the chat if you have any questions or you want to make any suggestions or chime in. Please just jump in and do that. So I want to introduce you to one really key concept within the field of restorative justice, which is this social discipline window here. So the social discipline window is a concept that it's basically an approach to how we maintain social norms and behavioral boundaries. And so if you think about on the left here, this idea of having control, we also think about it as limit setting or discipline. I like to think about it as structure, but also as accountability. Where do we fall? Where do we fall in creating that level of control? I don't really personally like that word, but it kind of encapsulates all of those concepts that I just described. On the other hand, on the very bottom there, you see support. So support, encouragement, nurture, resources. How are we supporting folks in getting things done in the way that they need to be done, right? In a way that's empowering. Where and how does that fall? So I want to just name this because, first of all, we could spend all day on just this one tool, if you will. This is such an important concept within restorative practices because there's so many ways that we can look at this. So, I'm going to ask you for some examples here, but I do want to just name that we could look at this from a perspective of where did we learn our own version in our lives around discipline, around control, and around support. What were we taught at a young age around what were we offered, right? So if we, just for some examples, if we're in an environment that has very high control, but very low support, this is that idea of doing things to people, and that it's much more punitive. Punishment is kind of the go-to, right? You didn't meet my expectations in the workplace, and it doesn't matter that you didn't have the support that you need. You didn't meet those expectations. Now there's a consequence. Now there's a write-up, right? Or now there's you're in trouble. Now you're having a conversation with the boss, something like that. If we're talking about there's actually really no or very low control or structure or discipline or limits or boundaries, but there's also not a lot of support. Right? And again, we could name, I'm sure all of us could name experiences that we've had in each of these 4 boxes. But what does that look like, that environment where there's actually, the power is really not even utilized. There's no support. It's almost kind of like I'm not caring, right? So let's say if someone at your work setting, they're asked to do a project, but they're not given a lot of structure around what the project is, but they're also not given a lot of support around what that is, then it's just kind of like, it just kind of is there, but there's not a lot of movement. There's not a lot of engagement or active responsibility taking, right? Because there just isn't that high level of control or structure, or there isn't high level of support. If we were to go to this for or permissive box, this is where, we exist in environments or relationships where there's a ton of support, ton of support, but there's not a lot of structure. There's not a lot of rules or boundaries. And so when we do that, we often are doing things for people, right? We're giving people passes all the time. We're not holding people accountable for what they're doing ultimately. We're just continuing to give them support, hoping that they kind of make different changes, make different decisions, do things differently, right? And so this generally doesn't work very well either. And then you have this idea of the with, or the restorative box here in the top right, where there's really high structure and accountability and limits if needed. There's also really high support in helping people get done what they need to get done. And obviously in each setting, high structure and high support, or really structure and support, or control and support, is going to look different in each setting. But the idea is that we can use our power in all of these ways, right? So if you think about the concept of, well, let's see, let me step back. What I want to do before I go into a little bit more of some examples is, first of all, I just want to ask you, are there questions? Are there initial questions about this box? Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna give you a couple scenarios, and I'm gonna ask in the chat that you write your response to what you where this scenario fits in which box. Okay. So here's the first scenario, and in the chat you're just going to write if this falls in the to box, the not box, the with box, or the for box. Okay. So here's a scenario. You leave work early because you're not feeling well, but forget to tell your supervisor. Upon your return to work, you find that you've been written up for insubordination. Where does that response fall in this box, if you will, of, yeah, to, with, not, or for? To. Sonora, you have an advantage because you just went through our training. I love that. That's great. Okay, to. So why would someone be willing? Yeah, why would someone be willing to say, why do you say to? Why does that feel like a to use of power? And feel free to just jump in, unmute and jump in. Rita.
So I was thinking we actually don't really have enough information for that scenario,
Okay.
because you don't know if that's a habit of her leaving and not communicating. So maybe I put down to punitive in there, but maybe it's because that's the third time it's happened. So you really don't have enough information on that to see if it's something like that. Maybe he has spoken to the person before.
Absolutely.
So,
thanks for helping us just name that you don't have the full context, right? And so obviously in these little examples, there's a lot of unknowns. And so I appreciate you naming that, because yeah, if it is a pattern, then maybe getting a write-up is part of what is already written within the business rules, and this person already knew that. And so that's actually in alignment with the policies of the organization, that this is what happens if this happens after several times, right? And in this case, it doesn't sound like they necessarily had a conversation, right? So it was just, I had to leave for work, I wasn't feeling well, and then I came back and now I'm being written up. So it's the opportunity for, where's that opportunity for conversation? So we're going to use this example and kind of walk through the box here. Kelly, thank you for adding this. Fear is not a tool to build relationships. Absolutely. And yet, how many times do we, each of us, and our systems and our businesses and our organizations go to this too punitive model, right? How often does it actually occur? Because that's what we think we're supposed to do. That's what we've been taught. That's what kind of is the norm at some level. And so it takes some intention, it takes some conscientious choices to choose to not be in this two box. And it takes a time and energy, absolutely, as well. Okay, so how about same scenario, leave work early because you're not feeling well. You know you're not supposed to leave work early, but you just not feeling well, you don't tell your supervisor, and then the next day there's no conversation or there's no follow-up at all. It's almost like they didn't even know you were gone. Again, knowing that this is a limited snapshot, where might that fall in the box? Four, okay, not. Yeah, great. So there's some fours and there's some nots. Okay. Not. For those of you who are saying it's in the not. Yep. Leaning towards not. Yeah, and again, there's so many grays and nuances here. For those of you that are leaning towards that not box, can you just share a little bit more as to why that might be not? Where and how is the power being used in the situation? Feel free just to jump in or put more in the chat if you'd like. And Rita, do you have your hand raised again, or is that from last time? Okay, great. Yeah, so and again, feel free to jump in because I want to be able to hear your voices as well. And just to name that, you know, in this sense, if we're saying that this person they've not taken accountability for what's happened, they've made a choice, they haven't informed anyone, so they haven't communicated, and they also haven't taken responsibility for, I know I'm not supposed to be doing this, but I'm doing this. And then the next day, no one follows up, or there's hardly even an acknowledgement that even happened. There's not as much, yeah, there's no conversation. Yeah, it seems like they don't care. Absolutely. Thanks, Carol. So again, that can, if that happens, how does that help build trust in the relationship with this employee and administration or colleagues, right? Or does it take away trust? And so then this not last, but this next piece here. So what if we say that this situation, this person has been sick several times and they're just going to leave whenever they need to leave, but they don't request that time. In fact, sometimes they don't even put it in their timesheet to take the time off for sick leave, right? They just do what they need to do. And the supervisor realizes that they have a lot of current health needs. And so they're just kind of letting them do what they need to do. Where does that fall? Yeah, thanks, Sonora. Yeah.
So I kind of feel like that in both of those situations. The whole management and culture team doesn't actually support teamwork. There doesn't seem like it supports any kind of relationship building or community, because either you don't care, and it's just like, if the management doesn't care if you're coming and going, then it doesn't really, like, why should you care? And what kind of job security and loyalty do you have to the company and your job? And if you can get away with everything, I think that for the employees that show up all the time, it's like, well, why? Because then they end up having to pick up the slack for the person of not showing up.
Right.
So that doesn't form a community, and that doesn't form a positive environment. So going too much in each way, I just think that the workplace itself is not supporting a positive, nurturing culture itself. And I feel like that belongs to the management to
Mhm.
fix it and to repair it, because the employees are coming in expecting, I would think, a positive workplace. Otherwise, they wouldn't have committed to working there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for naming all of those nuances too, because you just named, if all of these things are happening, how and where are they creating conflicts in other ways in a work setting, right? If other employees are saying, well, this person's doing this and no one's saying anything to them, why can't I do that, right? How does that impact the culture? How does that impact communication or the desire to want to contribute or to work, or like you're saying, this creating this team atmosphere? And so all of these have the ability to have a negative impact on our work culture, on our teamwork, on our communication, on conflicts developing. And also to say that these are also all normal and human, and so they happen. And again, going back to that choice point, we also always have a choice of how then could we create, if we recognize and acknowledge some of these power dynamics are happening, how can we make some decisions to move towards, maybe we need to offer some higher structure, higher control, higher accountability. Maybe we need to offer higher support and encouragement or resources. So I just think that this can be a helpful visual, because all of us are in all of these boxes pretty regularly, right? We could go back and do this whole thing of, again, where did we learn in our growing up? Where did we tend to fall? Where did our parents tend to fall? Where do we see ourselves in our personal lives, oftentimes using our power? And then where do we use power, and where do we find ourselves within our businesses or our organizations or work settings? So I'm not trying to demonize any of these, but just simply to say what an opportunity this is to think about this concept within our use of power for ourselves, but then also in the environments where we work. And so the question is, one of the questions is, how do we create opportunities to be more with people? How do we create that high structure and accountability and high support, and what that looks like? And I just want to emphasize the difference, because oftentimes people use accountability and punishment to some extent as the same thing, but they're actually not. So punishment, going to these boxes, but punishment is something we do to people and it's passive. Whereas with accountability is doing things with people, it's active. If we're taking accountability, we need to choose that. We need to take responsibility. So the choice point is an active taking of accountability and responsibility. And so in that, then if other people are doing that as well, if we're all coming forward to the table or to the team meeting to say, I got to take accountability for X, Y, or Z, and make that a norm in our work cultures, and not emphasize the shame or the blame or the fear in that, right? But to create an opportunity for us to name, I got to take accountability for this, and I realize there is an impact, and here's what I want to do to make it right. That's a restorative practice, and those are the concepts we can utilize in our work settings. But it takes some work, and it takes a different lens, especially when most of us work in systems that oftentimes use more of a punitive model of how we engage, and certainly a lot of systems in our communities do. So hopefully that feels like a helpful frame for you all. And I am going to send out the PowerPoint so that you have the opportunity to just kind of look at this and keep engaging. Oops, looks like we got a little frozen here. So I wanted to just name a couple additional pieces that will, I think, be helpful in kind of this idea of workplace conflict. Now, I'm looking at this in a couple ways. I always start with this personal responsibility, right? When we're able to and willing and regularly engage in self-inquiry and then share that learning, how might that help change and shift the dynamics of what's happening in our workplace settings? So some of these questions that I just listed here in case they're helpful to y'all, and certainly I look at these quite often myself, not just our own personal learning around personal awareness, which is a fabulous place to start and essential, right? But then it's also looking at these questions from a point of, how does this actually align? Do these align with my business or organizational values and our practices? Or are there disconnects, right? Am I answering these in some way that I feel like I'm in alignment, but then I notice when I go to work, I'm out of integrity here. And here are the ways. Maybe it's around time. Maybe it's around following through, doing what I say I'm going to do. Maybe it's lack of communication. Maybe it's just making assumptions versus, asking more questions and being curious with one another. And so I'm naming these because I'm hopeful that they can be a helpful maybe starting point for your own personal inquiry of where you might want to ask yourself, where and how do you show up in conflict in your own use of power in these situations, even before you get into conflict, right? And then this is a little bit of a side note, but certainly in alignment. I know that there are times, and many of us work in places where we're front facing, we're outward facing to the public. And so I just wanted to name a couple pieces around this de-escalation point specifically, just to, again, see if they're helpful from the point of this restorative base, right? So certainly if at any point you feel like your safety is at risk, please call 911. That's their role, and we want to make sure that you stay safe. So number one, right? And then a couple other pieces to keep in mind. If we're engaging with someone who's escalated, who's a customer or a colleague, or a potential colleague, or someone that walks into our door or something of that sort, some things that can be helpful in this initial response or de-escalation. So just to name that all of our behaviors are actually an attempt to meet some kind of need. Ultimately, we act because we have needs and we're trying to get those needs met. So regardless, ultimately, of what someone is saying or doing, they're doing that in a way to try to get a need met. And so what we can do in response, again, if we feel safe and we feel comfortable doing this, is we can ask a question. Oh, I realize I didn't finish my sentence here on the slide. We can ask a question to that person that inquires about their need versus just focusing on their behavior. So for an example, if someone comes in and they're pretty escalated, we can say something, we can acknowledge what's happening. Looks like you're pretty frustrated. Looks like you're pretty angry with what's happening. I'm wondering how I can help you, right? Or I'm wondering, what is it that you need in this moment? It sounds like you're really upset with this order, and I'd like to learn more about why you're upset. And in order to do that, I need us to be able to have a conversation. I'm here to work with you on understanding that. Help me to understand where you're coming from, right? And so if we're able to identify what they're exuding, but not emphasize, not just say, stop doing this, because we generally know that if we're just going to say that to someone, that's going to create kind of this trigger of, well, I'm going to do it more, or I'm going to do it differently, or stop telling me what to do, right? And so there's all of these kind of reactions that we get to. But if we can say as much as possible, kind of in this clear, kind, direct way, I see that this is happening. What do you need? How can I help you right now? I understand that you want to be able to, spread out here in the library, and that's not a place to do that. But we do want to offer you a place to be able to be in the library right now. How can I support you in making that happen? So you're trying to get to the person's need, and then you're saying something that builds a bridge to be with the person in their need, right? We're not saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. That would be more too. But we're acknowledging what's happening, and then we're saying something in a way that tries to build a bridge to be with the person in their need. And again, that only works if we have clear boundaries and guidelines and structure and clear support, right? It doesn't work nearly as well if we try to use one of those other forms of using our power. And so again, just to name that our personal awareness is so important in those opportunities, that we really, as much as possible, shouldn't take things personally. As much as you can in those moments, recognizing what's happening inside of us, and then attend and regulate as much as we can, or if we have to and we need to and we can, to take a little bit of a break and come back and readdress it. Excuse me. And then also, if there's some kind of incident that's occurred that feels pretty overwhelming, to then be able to debrief afterwards and get some support for you and or your team. Because even if it feels like it's not that big of a deal, we don't know what's triggered and comes up with people, especially if there's a situation where things are getting a bit more escalated. So just a last piece here, just to name that, you know, we talked about some personal inquiry, right? Personal opportunities for reflection. And then if I wanted to just share some possible opportunities for more organizational reflection. So thinking about in your organization, your workplace, what are some of the common or prevalent conflicts? You know, we just did some brainstorming here, but maybe doing a little bit of a deeper dive in your work setting, and maybe that's with your team, right? And from that point, then being able to look at the use of power. And so look at the social discipline window, which is what we just looked at, right? And look at and maybe come up with examples. Oh, this is how we tend to, as an organization, respond in a punitive way. This is how we tend to respond in a maybe more of a for way, or a not way, or a with way. Or gosh, there's lots of opportunities for us to, how could we build in more opportunities for us to share power with other people, with our colleagues, with the administration, you know, with our customers, through communication, through transparency, through accountability. What does that look like? What does that mean? So maybe just using this tool as a way to engage further in your own workplace. There's also a concept called the drama triangle. It was created in the late 1960s by Dr. Cartman. And the idea is that in relationships or interactions, if we're not mindful, oftentimes someone is playing either the role of the hero, the persecutor, or the victim. And we oftentimes just replay that concept over and over in our engagements. And so if we're to shift out of those dynamics and shift away from creating of the drama, we can shift into these ideas of coach and creator and challenger. And those new roles have to do with taking our own accountability, but also being asking for support in what we need, right? And also being willing to build trust with one another and voice what it is that we need. So again, you're going to get this PowerPoint so that you can click into some of these opportunities to learn a little bit more about each of these things. And then just to say briefly, because I want to be mindful of our time, another restorative practice is this idea of fair process. So it's a way for us to engage with one another, especially around group decision-making, that uses 3 steps of engagement, explanation, and expectation of clarity. It's not so that we're collectively making a decision. It's so that we're gathering feedback in a way that feels fair and that we're really giving people a true chance to be able to name and voice what's happening. And then ultimately, as leaders and decision makers, we can make that decision and then we report back, here's the decision we made based on X, Y, and Z. So that it's closing of the loop. We're not giving away responsibility for the decision making, but we're inviting people to be with us in the process of that. Also, this idea of engaging in regular team building and positive team building and connection and building relationships, building trust, building rapport. That's so essential, because then when conflict does happen, because as we know it will, especially if we're using a model of restorative practices in response to conflict and also in response or in the regular team building, then we already have a tool and a practice that we can use to then respond to challenges or conflicts that occur. So another clear restorative practice is this idea of restorative conversations. If you go to this link here, it will take you to what the steps of creating restorative conversation is, and how that could be beneficial. Also, just wanting to name that incorporating, training and perspectives and active engagement around diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that we're not operating from places of implicit bias or microaggressions, right, which can oftentimes create some real challenges and conflicts in work settings. also, you know, this idea right now, I didn't name this specifically, but we have, what is it, 4 or 5 generations operating in the workplace right now. And what are the challenges that come from those differences? So that might be a beneficial training to just get more information about. And then certainly there's lots of restorative justice or restorative practices consultants, as well as DEI consultants. And sometimes you can find people that actually have training in both that can be of support if you want to do it before that. Okay, so last slide here from me, and then just see if you all have any questions. So I just wanted to name, just to highlight what we already have available here in our Englewood community. So the Englewood Library actually does offer an introduction to nonviolent communication. NVC is a concept that was developed by, is it Marshall Rosenberg? I think is his last name, Rosenthal. I should know that, but I don't. And it's just a very specific way of communicating around what are our needs and what are our requests. And there's many more nuances around that, but that's what it really emphasizes. So they offer training at least twice a year, if not 3 times a year. It's free. The next one's coming up. I definitely recommend and invite you to check that out. That's the link that will get you to register on the Englewood Library website. And then if you're interested around how do we utilize these concepts of restorative justice and power with one another, how do we utilize these to support public safety and enhance community resilience in our own community of Englewood, I would really invite you to join us for an upcoming information session. I dive a little bit deeper in some of just some of the basics of restorative justice, but then also how do we utilize that here in the criminal legal system and in our court system, as well as then opportunities to get more involved if you're interested. So we have a lot more information on our website, and certainly you can also contact me if you have any questions. So I see that there is chat here. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen for now. I just want to open it up for any last questions that you all have, and then I also want to pose one last question for you all to respond.
Ames, real quick, one of the things that why we also wanted to have this conversation is it was around, it began, I think I'd mentioned in my introduction, around homelessness.
Yeah.
And even maybe Tracy can add some to that too. But I think some of our for-profit businesses are frustrated with some of the homelessness that's growing in our city, and some of our nonprofit businesses, and maybe there's a little on maybe some finger pointing towards our nonprofit businesses as causing some of that. But I think it's the change and newness of that. I mean, it almost takes into a third party of some sort, you know, being the 2 businesses and then our homeless population. Is there any advice within what you've shared so far to begin to have that conversation?
Yeah,
that you would have?
So just to name briefly, and certainly, you know, there's just, we could dive in way deeper if we needed to down the road, but there has been some initial talk around, is there an opportunity for having what we call restorative conversations, or a restorative circle, or a listening circle, or a community circle, where each of these parties comes to the table. It's not the panel that Change the Trend have had, which have been fantastic and so informative and wonderful. It's kind of, in my mind, the next step. So what are the challenges? Let's really identify those. What are the commonalities? What are the values? And not just talk about them kind of on the surface, but to be able to engage in a facilitated conversation to really grapple with those. What are the points of connection? What are the needs, right?
And with that, that would include members of the for-profit community, members of the nonprofit community, and members of the folks that are experiencing homelessness. Absolutely. In your mind?
Yeah, it could also include folks from the PD and folks from the city, right? And so there'd be a lot of preparation to help support the development of that conversation, but it's absolutely doable. And it's done in a way that we create a safe and structured, high structured environment and conversation. People know what to expect. People know what questions that we're going to ask and engage in. But there's also high support. We're coming in with the opportunity of wanting to listen, wanting to really learn from one another, build relationships, build trust. And that could be, I mean, that's obviously takes a lot of work to get up and running, but that could be
Sure.
an opportunity. So obviously
Thank you.
more, yeah, absolutely.